Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. It's National Distracted Driving Awareness Month, and we thought what better time than to spread awareness about the deadly challenge that faces us all and what we're doing about it. But before we get started, here's a video to remind us of why distracted driving has become such an important topic for everyone.
Say one. Say two. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. High five.
Number 13 Columbia, number 13 Columbia. Major traffic crash, need multiple ambulance.
Randall he's outgoing, energetic, selfless. He was always donating blood, and he had donated a kidney when I was almost 20 weeks pregnant with Aspen. Aspen and him were the best buddies. She was always wanting to be right there, whatever he was doing, she was going to be there, and he was really good at including her. I miss most just being able to talk to him and just walking in and him smiling and, you know, his infectious laughter and just being able to share. That's what I miss the most.
Seeing this unfold in front of you is different than what we normally see in our line of work. This one went from where I thought I was going to be the one that was struck to seeing someone else go flying in the air. Crashes are preventable. That's what it comes down to. All of them come down to someone making a bad choice and putting something more important than driving as their priority.
Thank you for this video, Adrian. This story, your story, touches our hearts. It's been said, these are not just numbers. They're mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, sons and daughters. This is why we're here today, to help all understand why paying full attention to the driving task is so critical. These losses aren't felt in a data table. We feel them at the dinner table. Lives are changed or ended in literally seconds, but the impact continues forever. Missed birthdays, holidays, weddings, births, graduations never celebrated. That's what it means to lose a life. We learn to live with the pain, but it never goes away. Every day, there are many distracted driving crashes because someone wanted to read or write a text, talk on the phone, or watch a video. And they felt they could multitask doing one of these things and drive simultaneously. Those are the so-called reasons that more than 3,000 lives are lost every year and all of the subsequent moments. And that's a significant undercount. These numbers do not include the tens of thousands of life-altering injuries, the brain damage, the amputations, the burns that someone will live with for the rest of their lives. Eliminating distracted driving has been on NTSB's most wanted list for years, but now it's an epidemic and a problem that's been growing for almost 2 decades. The National Distracted Driving Coalition was formed to collaborate with the many local and national groups and help to guide a more cohesive response to this deadly challenge. Different groups have different strengths and experiences, which are shared with all. No one group has to gather data, figure out how to approach the legislature, media, or assist educational institutions. Someone in the coalition has already done that and is ready to share. Together, we are stronger and more effective. Now, the NTSB recommends that every state ban drivers from using handheld and hands-free devices, except for navigation and emergency use. And we support all the successes that the groups are having along the way towards achieving this goal with handheld and texting bans. The objective very simply, is to save lives. These groups can play to their strengths without duplicating their efforts, and together we can mount a national effort to encourage full attention on the road. This afternoon, each of our panelists will take a few minutes for presentations, and then following the presentations, the panel will discuss what we've seen and heard, and we've also asked for some questions from our audience. In order of their presentation sequence, we'll hear from Adrienne Siddons, who is the survivor advocate who lives in Missouri. Then we'll have Robin Robertson's report, and she's president and CEO of Traffic Injury Research Foundation. Then Joel Feldman, who is the founder of enddistracteddriving.org. Robert Passmore, American Property Casualty Insurance Association. And finally, Ian Reagan, the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. So Adrienne, you've suffered a lot here. We'd like to hear a little bit more. Would you lead us off, please?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I am a single mother of 3, ages 4, 3, and 2. I'm a mother who faces grief and depression daily, but a mother who moves forward each day, attempting to make life for my children as normal as possible. I once envisioned a life much different than the one that I live now, a life for my husband, Randall, who was killed because of a distracted driver. Randall is my other half. We made each other better. We had plans on how we would live our lives, how we would raise our kids, and how we would chase our dreams together. The way Randall looked at life was so unique. He was passionate about change, growth, and improvement. He was exciting and extroverted, thoughtful and analytical. His hobbies and passions would change through the years, but he was the person who could and would master everything he tried. Randall was a person who could push me out of my comfort zone. He made sure our kids did the same, including them in everything he loved to do. He was so much fun to experience things with, and I loved experiencing life through his point of view. We couldn't wait to show our kids the world he envisioned for our family. That vision was taken from us on May 5th when a driver chose to video chat instead of focusing on driving. Randall's job that day was to set up and clean up traffic cones for a triathlon race. After the bike course had finished, Randall's team began to pick up process. The trucks they used for collecting the cones had flashing yellow lights. They had police escort with lights on behind them, and they were working in a coned-off lane. Randall also wore a neon hat and vest. Despite all of these safety precautions taken on that clear sunny day, the distracted driver never saw Randall or his crew and never hit the brakes. Randall was struck, thrown 120 feet in the air, but survived, albeit unconscious and suffering from internal bleeding, multiple pelvic fractures, humeral fracture, injuries to both of his knees, and a traumatic brain injury. I endured 6 months in hospitals and clung to hope that this would be a bad memory. But the worst day of my life occurred November 18th, 2019, when I had to make the decision to stop treatment and take Randall off of the ventilator, knowing that the life we dreamed of could not be lived from a hospital bed. This loss is something I will have to live with my entire life. I must go through this life without my best friend. My kids have to go through life without their dad. It is now a part of me, a part of my story, and a part of their story. However, my story continues. I feel the loss of Randall every day, but I keep moving forward. Our 3 children are growing up so fast, and I see so much of Randall in them. It is painful to know what they're missing. I am determined to make sure that they know who their dad was and give them as many opportunities to experience a life and adventure he would have. Through this, I've learned more about distracted driving than I ever cared to, and how it's impacted other Missouri families and families across the country every single day. As you may know, Missouri currently has one of the weakest texting and driving laws of any state, only prohibiting drivers 21 and younger from texting while driving. But on a larger scale, beyond the politics, it's become clear that what we must do more of to shift the culture around distracted driving in the US. Far too often, drivers are choosing to drive distracted even when they are fully aware of the dangers. That's why for the last 2 years, I've been working with our state's hands-free coalition in Missouri to fight for change and make sure my family's tragedy does not happen to anyone else. And that's why the work of this national coalition is so important as well. Randall should be the one here advocating and sharing his story. He would have done it with so much passion and enthusiasm, making sure to explore every avenue to reach as many people as possible. And so that is what I am striving for, reaching as many people as possible to share his story in hopes that no one will experience the loss that me and my children now face. Death caused by distracted driving is preventable, and I'm here to make that a reality.
Thank you, Adrienne. That's a very powerful statement. Next, we'll go to Robin Robertson.
We go. Thanks very much, Vice Chairman. We certainly appreciate the leadership of the NTSB in taking on this important issue. And Adrienne, I think your story is really such a poignant reminder of the consequences. And, you know, what we see from the data, the most important point from data is that in distracted driving fatalities, it's most often the non-distracted road user who's the one who pays the ultimate price. So our sincere condolences for your loss. I would like to take a little bit of time and talk about the National Distracted Driving Coalition that was formed with the leadership of the NTSB. I'm very pleased to be chairing this initiative, and I've had the opportunity as the president and CEO of the Traffic Injury Research Foundation in Canada to chair a Canadian coalition on distracted driving. So the opportunity to contribute to like-minded entity in the US, I think is so important, and I appreciate the opportunity. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the coalition and some of the work of the coalition. So the vision of the National Distracted Driving Coalition is really, as the Vice Chairman said, to accelerate national efforts to implement effective interventions and to encourage attentive driving by eliminating distractions. And the organizations that have come together all have an important role to play in achieving that vision. And the mission is really to promote innovative strategies and collaborative approaches to create that traffic safety culture of attentive drivers. A little bit of information about the National Distracted Driving Coalition. So the organizations involved in this initiative came together to form a national action plan consisting of 21 action items that really targeted 6 key areas, those being the improvements of data, education, focus on employers and workplace safety policies, enforcement legislation, and technologies. So there's a lot of work to be done in each of these areas, and the National Action Plan can contribute to this initiative. The primary focus for the coalition is really on distracted driving and the different types of in-vehicle distractions that exist. So there are 29 member organizations contributing to the coalition, representing government, insurance, academia, nonprofits, and corporate entities. And then we also have an additional 31 stakeholder organizations that contribute to the work of the coalition through various subcommittees, and those stakeholders represent in the insurance industry, technology companies, telecommunications, local communities, academia, health, corporate entities, government, and the trucking industry. So the pervasiveness of the problem really requires a very inclusive and collaborative approach, and that's the intention of the coalition, is to come together to bring their resources, their knowledge, their expertise to bear to complete the National Action Plan. So there's the full action plan of 21 items, which is available on the coalition website at usnddc.org. And I'm going to spend a minute or two and just talk about some of the action plan priorities and the work completed last year and the priorities for this year. So one of the most important things was to create that online centralized resource that the Vice Chairman talked about that would allow us to share expertise and allow organizations to spend more time implementing initiatives and less time looking for information. We've also spent time working on prevalence data. It's critically important to be able to measure the problem because if we can't measure the problem, then it's very difficult to inspire leadership to address it. So we're looking at different sources of prevalence data to create a better understanding of the size of the problem. There's work being done that you'll hear about today with respect to a national survey that was really designed to identify barriers to behavior change and motivators to behavior change, and I'm looking forward to learning more about that. We also have work underway to look at educational messaging to increase awareness about the risks associated with hands-free technologies. We often focus on handheld, and yet there are also risks associated with hands-free, and it's important to understand those to make safer choices. There's work underway that you'll hear about also today with respect to children and youth to enhance prevention initiatives. Looking at work for best practices in the workplace. Employers have an important role to play in mitigating distraction and preventing distraction in the workplace. And then opportunities, to Adrienne's point about ways to inform the development of policy and legislation with good information. Action plan priorities for 2022 that are just getting underway is work with employers to make sure that the differences between handheld and hands-free communication technologies are understood, and to compile some best practice tools to manage distraction in the workplace. Education materials with respect to sharing the roads with large trucks. I think we're all familiar with the consequences of large truck crashes, and distraction on the road by passenger vehicle drivers or large truck drivers can have significant consequences that are to be avoided. Also some work underway with respect to law enforcement in terms of workplace prevention of distracted driving, but also the enforcement of laws and the equitable enforcement of distracted driving laws. And then looking at some of the technologies and opportunities to prevent distractions, to understand how they work and what their limitations are, and ways that they can be integrated into prevention practices. So before I close, I just want to go back to the issue of the prevalence of distracted driving. As the Vice Chairman said, fatal crashes are a profound concern. More than 3,000 people were killed on US roadways as a result of distraction in 2020. And those were all people, not numbers, but 3,000 people with friends, families, and communities who were also impacted. So official crash data provides us with one window on the problem, but there's also some limitations with respect to crash data, meaning it doesn't give us the entire picture of how prevalent distracted driving is. That's in part because it's very difficult in a collision situation for police to make determinations in terms of whether a phone or another distraction played a role, particularly if the vehicle occupants are killed or not willing to speak up and say that they were distracted behind the wheel. There's also limitations with respect to the crash report forms that we use to collect data about crashes. And then sometimes that data is collected, but it's difficult to query. So the prevalence of the problem, we know some about it from crash data, but not enough. Similarly, self-report data, which is when we do annual public opinion polls. A number of organizations across the US conduct public opinion polls. Our office in the US conducts one such poll, and what we've seen in the last few years is an increase in distracted driving. We did see some declines in 2020, and part of that was, everyone was preoccupied with the pandemic and there was less driving. But we do find that the pandemic was one of the sources of distraction. But looking at talking on their phone prior to the pandemic, in 2019, we saw almost 17% of drivers, a little bit more than 17%, were talking on their phone while they were driving. We've also seen some increases, not just in distracted driving and texting, but also talking on the phone. So we know from self-report data that it's not a small problem, and as such, we need to do more, not just to address it, but also to measure it. And then self-report surveys also suffer from some limitations as well. So there are other data sources that can be used, and those would include observational surveys at the roadside. Those would include cell phone use data. But again, they provide us with windows on the problem, but not a complete picture. And ultimately, as I said, it's very important to improve the quality of data showing how often distracted driving occurs. Is important because, again, if we can't prove it's a problem, then we can't inspire leadership and ensure the allocation of resources to prevention. So the good news is, coming out of the work of the coalition and the subcommittee looking at this issue, is that there are other opportunities to improve data collection, to better understand the problem, which are being explored. And some of those opportunities include phone applications, as well as naturalistic driving data, and also roadside smart camera technology. So work is underway through the coalition to be able to explore and better understand this issue, and look at new mechanisms for quantifying the problem. So with that, I'm going to stop and turn it back over to the Vice Chairman, but I would encourage everyone to check out the website of the National Distracted Driving Coalition at usnddc.org. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Robin. I am a data point of one that believes that the problem is vastly understated in terms of the raw data numbers. And I think most of us who have driven any distance at all, when I drove into the office today, I counted 4 people that were obviously distracted. And these are in areas where we have distracted driving laws. So I happen to be a big believer in technology. So thank you very much. Joel Feldman, you are up next. So we'd love to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. And I am very fortunate to be a part of the National Distracted Driving Coalition. And I'm very, very excited about the contributions that we'll be able to make. I don't know if we have the ability to show one of those slides that I sent over. If we do, why don't we put that up? Well, actually, that's from a presentation, a PowerPoint that we give. And I firmly believe students can help us save lives by changing the way we think about distracted driving. Often we talk about distracted driving and we say, hey, we have to change the culture so that just like drunk driving, distracted driving is not socially acceptable. Well, admittedly, we haven't done a great job doing that so far, but I am optimistic. I am optimistic. So how did I get involved in working on distracted driving? Maybe if you can go to the next slide. That's my baby, Casey. And Casey was 21 when she was killed by a distracted driver. And I no longer say Casey died. I say Casey was killed the way Adrian said that Randall was killed, because a driver made a choice. He made a choice to take his eyes off the road and reach for his GPS as he was traveling. Casey was walking in a crosswalk. It was a beautiful summer day, and he went through a stop sign and he hit Casey. He said that he never saw her, and we were called to get to the hospital. And 4 hours later, the surgeons told us, well, actually, they didn't have to say a thing. When they walked into the room, you could look at their faces and you knew that Casey was dead. My world changed, my wife's world changed, our son's world changed, and everybody who loved Casey, their world's changed, and it'll never go back to the way it was. And sometimes I summarize it by just saying, you know, I'm alive and my child is dead. I'm the one with the future, and it's not supposed to be that way. And I will never, ever come fully to terms with that. But I can do something, and I have done something about it. I can work to keep other young people, not just young people, but all of us safe. I've been fortunate to work with researchers, other advocates, members of the coalition on different projects, and others child psychologists and all, and we've come up with some novel ways of reaching people. I am a believer that if you successfully, and I put that in quotes, drove distracted without being in a crash, it's not probably going to be too effective if we tell you how dangerous it is. So we need other ways. We need other ways to connect with people. In the courtroom, after the man who killed Casey left, his wife talked to me, and she was very kind. But during the course of that conversation, she told me that he only looked away for a few seconds. So my daughter's dead, and someone only looked away for a few seconds. I've worked with about 20 people now who killed or crippled while driving distracted. They come to me through the court systems of various places to do their community service hours. And I ask them, what are the excuses? Why did you do this? How did you rationalize this? Just a few seconds. I'm a safe driver. I can handle it. Everybody does it. It's an important text or call. So what we need to do is we need to expose those excuses. I mean, just think about it. I'm a safe driver. I've never been in a crash. How is that at all predictive that we won't be in a crash tomorrow, the next day, or next month? And then I also want to address the fact that if you talk about distracted driving, it's a story of hypocrisy. And that starts with me. I'm a lawyer in Philadelphia. I represent folks who've been in crashes. Distracted driving crashes. I drove distracted all the time. Even when I'd leave the courtroom after advocating for a client, I'd be on my phone. Of course, that changed when my daughter was killed. Hypocrisy. The studies show that for most of us, our largest highway safety concern is other distracted drivers, 88 or 90%, according to a Cambridge mobile telematics survey that I saw. Yet, depending upon what surveys you look at, about 50% of us drive distracted. Hypocrisy. And then take moms and dads. Our children, our teens are the most vulnerable. They're the most inexperienced. They're addicted to their phones. And what do they have as examples? 80 to 90% of the kids I speak with tell me that their moms and dads drive distracted. So let's take a look at that. We're telling our children not to drive distracted. We all recognize that's a critical safety message. Why do we as parents think such a critical safety message will be effective when it's so tainted with hypocrisy? So tainted with hypocrisy. We have not done enough to keep our children safe. We failed in that. Our children are the most vulnerable, but they are the way out of this. When I show a video in my presentations, I show it to parents, I show it to kids. It's a bus driver doing outrageous things while he's driving, not even holding the steering wheel. Parents continually tell me it's risky and dangerous. But you know what our children tell us? It's selfish. It's disrespectful. It's inconsiderate. You want to change the culture of distracted driving in this country, you're not going to get there talking about danger. We need to personalize it with that driver. It's a selfish driver. It's someone who exhibits disrespect for others every time they look away from the road when driving. And it's someone who was inconsiderate to everyone around them. So I am optimistic. I'm very optimistic that our kids are going to lead us through this, and they're going to help us change the way we look at distracted driving. We need to devote more resources to them, and we need to rely upon our kids to help us to get there. Thank you. I appreciate the time.
Thank you very much, Joel. Two thoughts come to mind very quickly. One is when I was learning to drive, which was a very long time ago, that's when seatbelts were first coming in. And we were taught as teen drivers that the car didn't move until you had the seatbelt on. So we have an opportunity there to address this. The other point I would make is that distracted driving is becoming this decade's or last 2 decades equivalent of driving under the influence of a telephone as opposed to perhaps beverages. So I think we've got a lot of work to do here. And as you said, just talking about safety isn't going to do it alone. Next up, we have Robert Passmore with the Insurance Institute here, who's going to give us their view of how all of this works. So
Thank you very much. I am Bob Passmore. I'm Department Vice President of Personal Lines at the American Property Casualty Insurance Association, better known as APCIA, and I work in our Policy Development and Research Division. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, APCIA is the primary national trade organization for property casualty insurers with a legacy that dates back over 150 years, representing insurers of all sizes and structures and in all parts of the country. And we've long been doing what matters most by helping keep doing our part to keep individuals and communities safe. APCIA and the insurance industry have long played a key role in promoting safety, especially on our nation's road. And some of that isn't for obvious reasons, that the costs of a lot of these accidents are borne through the auto insurance mechanism, what we all pay for premiums and what insurers pay out in claims. But there's another reason why auto insurers in particular feel particularly passionate about this. Before I came to work for APCIA, I worked in claims for many years. And so I got to see firsthand, talking to accident victims and seeing firsthand what happens from a moment of inattention. So I know I'm particularly proud to be part of this effort and work on these kinds of auto safety issues in general and distracted driving in particular. One area where we've focused a lot of our work is on having a strong set of enforceable laws on distracted driving. APCIA was key in leading efforts to develop model legislation on distracted driving at the National Conference of Insurance Legislators. That's been the basis for a lot of the laws that have been passed in recent years, either passing new broadly based distracted driving laws, or upgrading those laws that were focused only on texting and things like that, and all the other types of new devices that find their way into vehicles today. So we're proud to be part of the National Distracted Driving Coalition, working to improve our laws and raise awareness on distracted driving issues. I'm happy to be part of today's discussions. Thank you very much.
thank you, Robert. One thing that comes to mind as we discuss this is my background is in aviation, and as pilots, obviously we think, well, we've never had a crash. Obviously, I must be pretty good. And as Robin has pointed out, it's the next trip that's the most important. And we have to keep that in mind, that past history means absolutely nothing, and it can all change literally in just a matter of seconds. So next up will be Ian Reagan. So Ian, if you would join us, that would be great.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. I'm honored to be on this panel today, and just a little bit about myself before I jump to my presentation. I've been with the Insurance Institute since 2012 as a senior research scientist, and before that I was with the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration as a research psychologist. And one of my areas of focus is on driver distraction, particularly with how drivers interact with technology, whether it's a portable device like cell phones that they've brought into the vehicle, or with infotainment systems. And so I've been looking forward to sharing some data with you, and I'll just pull up my slides and get to that. Okay, so before I jump into the data, I also want to acknowledge my colleague, Amy Cox, who led the development of this survey that I'm going to tell you about. And she's also heading the data analysis. So our survey, we just completed it recently, and one of the big motivations for it was to get an idea of what drivers are doing behind the wheel in 2022. And so this first figure shows some of that prevalence data. Each bar represents the percentage of drivers who reported that they engaged in these various activities on most or every drive that they made in the month leading up to the survey. So I'm not going to read out every behavior and percentage, but just point a couple things out to you. First, out of the 5 most prevalent behaviors, 3 of the 5 involve cell phone use, but 2, talking with passengers and eating or drinking don't involve any cell phone use at all. And we know that passenger presence is a big concern for younger drivers. So that was a concerning finding right there. But and I also want to draw your attention to the 3 sets of bars all the way to the right of the figure. And that is a set of very alarming results to me. The fact that 10% or so of our sample indicated that on most or every drive that they made in the month prior to completing the survey, they were conducting video calls, posting to social media, or watching a movie is really downright scary when you think about the level of engagement and engrossment really with the cell phone when you're doing those activities. So another big goal, as Robin alluded to, was to identify some factors that would motivate drivers to drive less distracted. And this is just a quick little snapshot of some of those results. So across the board, we had the highest level of agreement. Over 81% of our samples said that they would not want to drive. They agreed that they would not want to drive distracted if they heard the message that you could hurt or kill someone from a friend or a loved one. We also saw that 71% of our sample agreed that they wouldn't want to drive distracted if they knew that the risk of getting a ticket was high. And we know that enforcement, perceived risk of getting a ticket is an effective motivator. Whereas we saw that ads from celebrities was a less effective motivator. We also saw a lot of support for school campaigns. So and this goes back to Joel's point about the importance of getting the messages about the dangers of distracted driving to those loved ones who will take the messages back to the adult drivers. And then the last data point on this slide, I really wanted to pull out this data on automated enforcement because we know that automated enforcement has been very effective, a very useful tool for red light enforcement and speeding. And to see that a majority of our sample, 53%, supported automated enforcement for distracted driving, I think is a really promising finding. And I sort of wanted to finish on a point about cell phone blocking technology. I think there's a lot of potential in this technology to make an impact on distracted driving relatively soon. And I don't have a lot of time. I don't have the time to go into how the apps work. There are a lot of blockers out there, like iPhone's Do Not Disturb while driving. I think the biggest appeal, the best feature that they have is when they're running, the phone is going to stay dark. Incoming notifications are muted. And so the driver doesn't have that Pavlovian reflex to reach over and grab the phone when it vibrates or dings. And back in 2018, we did a survey of drivers who own smartphones. And we asked the iPhone owners whether or not they were using the Apple's Do Not Disturb while driving cell phone blocker. And we saw that only 20% had it set to turn on automatically or when it was connected to the vehicle's Bluetooth. And the reason why I wanted to sort of end on this note is that in our new survey, we saw that 2/3 of the drivers that we polled supported the notion of having a blocker that was like Do Not Disturb while driving, turn on automatically when their phone connects to their Bluetooth device. And so it's something I hope we can come back to during the discussion panel, and that'll conclude my presentation.
Thank you very much, Ian. That is our opening round here, so it sets the stage. So if all of our presenters would please turn on your cameras, we'll get started. I've got some questions, and this is intended to be an open and flowing discussion. So if you have a question or whatever, please raise your hand. And if you absolutely can't control yourself, that's perfectly fine. I want you to control yourself while you're driving, not necessarily during this discussion. First question, I guess, for Robin. What makes it so difficult to get a good handle on the data? I mean, you and I have agreed on multiple occasions that we do not have a good picture. We're seeing what I use, it's a bad metaphor, but literally just the tip of the iceberg.
Right. And you're exactly right. We are seeing the tip of the iceberg. I think some of the challenges with really getting a handle on prevalence is that it's difficult to detect. It's not like speeding, where we have a device where we can measure speed and definitively say you were speeding, or alcohol or cannabis, where we have devices or techniques where we can measure it. Distraction is very difficult to measure. It's very difficult to observe. I mean, one of the most significant kinds of distraction that is familiar to all of us is thinking about something else while we're driving. We tend to let our brain run to problem solve while we're behind the wheel. So you can't measure that, you can't observe that, and yet it's a significant risk. So I think that's one important piece of the challenge in terms of measuring. And the other one is really getting people to self-diagnose, to recognize. You often hear, and Joel talked about this, it was just for a second or just for 2 seconds. I think some of the behaviors we've done long before we realize the risk and that they're distracting. So we don't think of them as distracting. So even when you ask people to self-report how often they're distracted behind the wheel, I think there's that underestimation of truly how many times we take our attention off the driving task for any number of reasons. And, you know, at the end of the day, it's important to remember when we're talking about other drivers, that was another common theme that came up when we're measuring prevalence, we're thinking about other drivers, and not so much ourselves, but we don't control anyone else on the road, right? We control ourselves. So I think there are some important challenges there, and prompting people to think about the issue differently can also help us get a better handle on the prevalence of the problem.
So I have a question for Bob now, and this cuts to the chase. I talk about it a lot. You know, everything comes down to economics. How much is this costing all of us in terms of our insurance? I know I'm paying a lot for insurance.
Well, it's difficult to say, but what we all pay for auto insurance is primarily driven by 2 things: how many claims there are and how much those claims cost. So for a lot of reasons, including some of the data issues that Robin talked about, it's hard to pin down a specific dollar amount. But some things to consider. You know, we've already heard the number about how many people have been killed in accidents involving distraction. I think in 2019 it was over 3,000 people, but also nearly 500,000 people were injured in accidents involving distraction as well. About 1/5 of those killed were not in a car; they were outside of a vehicle, pedestrians, cyclists, which is an indicator that those accidents are going. If those people survive those kinds of accidents, those injuries, they're going to be much more severely injured and therefore higher claim costs. And that doesn't even include the cost of the everyday fender benders that occur, far less serious situations, but all those things come in there too. You know, you don't pay attention for a moment while you're backing up and you strike another vehicle or hit an object or something else. So those costs add up, and it's not just, you know, we've talked about device distraction, but you know, we've long been distracted by the radio or just lost in our own thoughts. So being cognizant about all those kinds of things is very important. I think that was an excellent point that Robin made before.
Would it be okay to just say this is costing us a lot?
I think that would be very safe to say this is costing us a lot.
Okay. Adrian, what's Missouri doing these days in terms of perhaps toughening up their laws? I mean, the laws we have a lot of places where they have laws in place, and it does seem to have some effect. But I'm interested in Missouri because I think it's one of the few states that, as you said, doesn't have a very strong law. What's happening going forward?
Yeah, so there are several bills and pieces of legislation right now in the House and in the Senate in Missouri that have gotten committee hearings and trying to get those up back to the floor to get a vote. But really, I mean, when it comes down to it, you know, we have our Missouri Hands-Free Coalition is over 30 different organizations. Everyone's really passionate and everyone's doing everything they can to push to make stricter laws and revise what we have. And the feeling I get is that the Capitol is a little bit in the way. That they're kind of the roadblock right now just to get this pushed through. You know, it's been an issue for lots of years. It's been, there's been several pieces of legislation that just haven't gone anywhere in past years. It is having a little bit of traction this year. I'm hopeful it'll cross the finish line and we'll get some stricter hands-free laws, but that remains to be seen.
I understand. Well, let's keep working on it. And as you know, there are lots of members in the coalition that have done this and done it successfully. So you can draw on that experience there. Joel, you're spending a lot of time working with young people. Tell us a little more about some of the reaction that you get from the high schools. And you mentioned the word hypocrisy, and we've had quite a problem with hypocrisy here of late, going just beyond distracted driving, but I won't get any farther into trouble than I already am. But your thoughts on that, and do the kids see it, and do they call their parents out?
The kids call their parents out all the time. And actually, one thing that's been really positive is some of the kids have come up to me and they've said, you know, my mom and dad drive distracted. I think it's up to me to teach my little brothers and sisters that even though mom and dad drive distracted, we don't drive distracted. So they're wonderful. They'll call parents out. And we actually just released a K-2 picture book, which I'll send to folks. And it basically teaches kids to recognize what distracted driving is. And it arms them with this language to speak up to mom and dad. Mom, dad, I love you, but I don't feel safe when you drive me and look at your phone. We tested that in focus groups of parents, and it's very, very powerful. It's a motivator. I mean, as parents, our job is to keep our kids safe. And if our kids telling us that we're doing something that makes them feel unsafe, it should hit us like a ton of bricks. And that's being very effective as well. And I have to give my apologies because I do have to step off for the another conference I have at 2:00. But I just did want to say before I left that we just signed an agreement with Harvard, and they're going to be doing a 15-month study involving focus groups, in-depth interviews, advisory panels of kids and teachers and coaches at schools, coming up with messages and slogans that are ultimately going to be filmed by the best high school filmmakers in the country. And that group promises we're going to get 2 peer-reviewed articles out of it. So I'm really excited about that as well. And that was made possible by being in the coalition and having access to researchers and everyone. And I'm excited about that. And I can't leave without telling Adrian, I've been playing Randall's video, your video, in my talk since AAA of Missouri gave it to me back in October. It is powerful. It connects with people. And thank you so much for producing it. Probably 10,000 people have seen it between me and my volunteer speakers. So thank you for that.
Joel, thank you very much. Go off and do good things. And I'm glad to hear that the coalition is being useful, and that some of the things that you've learned, be sure that you can pass it along to some of the other groups and post it on the website so they can learn how you did it, so that they can leverage off of your experiences. That's excellent.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody.
Ian, I have a question for you. Now you're sworn to secrecy here. I have an undergraduate degree in psychology. It's not something I'm proud of, but don't let it get around. But anyway, how do we influence people in doing some of these kinds of things, because we're dealing with this is an addiction, the addiction to cell phones. And it goes far beyond driving. Just as I was coming into work today, there was a young lady who was using a crosswalk, and she was staring at her phone, and she was totally oblivious to everything else that was going on. So how do we manage these addictions?
So I'll give you my opinion. I feel that, you mentioned earlier that you're a fan of technology, and the branch of psychology that I got my degree in is human factor psychology. And, we look at technology too. And I think that distracted driving is a problem that we need to look to some technological solutions to help us there. I mentioned cell phone blockers. That's one example. Driver monitoring systems that are becoming widely available for use with vehicles that or have some automation. Those systems are becoming available in the U.S., but in Europe they're promoting these driver monitoring systems as standalone units to alert the driver when they take their eyes off the wheel, and they're pretty advanced. They're using camera technology to look and see what the driver's doing. And so I'm very hopeful that technology can help us get there. And then another plug for technology is I also feel that the distraction is part of the driving task is very automatic for experienced drivers. People will get to the end of their trip and say, how did I finish my trip? And there's a certain level of just drivers become inattentive because the task is so easy. And that's where I think that crash avoidance can really be helpful, because they can act for the driver. If they do happen to look down, or a bug flies into the vehicle and lands on their leg, they look down for a second, automatic braking can step in for them and act as a safeguard. And so those are my thoughts on that.
Just to follow up a little bit more, I mean, the cars are getting more and more of these infotainment systems, and the screens are getting bigger and bigger. And this, to me, I realize that we're all tired of sitting in traffic jams, and I'll get in trouble for saying this as well, but I think all of the car commercials are just absolutely promoting the wrong thing. They show an open highway and nobody is ever stuck in traffic, so that you can drive as fast as you can on an open highway, and you got way more horsepower than you could ever possibly use. There's a Saturday Night Live skit in here someplace. But how do we adjust these kinds of vehicles and the screens and so on to maybe minimize some of those kinds of things? And likewise, even just the controls on the vehicle. Back in the old days, you had a dedicated control that you knew exactly where it was. You pushed a button and something happens. Now I've got 3 pages of screens and menus to get to adjusting the temperature.
Yeah, you bring up a big concern. I mean, the screens are getting bigger. They started with Tesla's 17-inch screen, and a lot of other automakers are following suit. And NHTSA released guidelines for reducing driver distraction, visual manual distraction from infotainment systems, but those guidelines have no teeth to them because they're voluntary. So, if they were mandatory, locking out tasks that require too much visual demand, I think, that's the quick way to address that.
Okay. Bob, I would imagine that our indications are that some of the large trucking companies and bus companies have taken a zero tolerance policy towards having their drivers engage with their personal electronic devices while the vehicle is in motion, because it's cost them, an individual crash can cost them easily multiple seven-figure kinds of payouts. What are your thoughts there? And is there something that we could do, or that the insurance community might do, to encourage people not to use their cell phones while they're driving?
Well, as I talked about before, APCI has been engaged in this fight against distracted driving for many years, but a lot of individual companies are also doing things to try to raise awareness or provide tools to their policyholders to just consider those kinds of things. For example, Travelers Insurance Company has a program called Every Second Matters that encourages drivers to speak up and set good examples about distracted driving, and provides tools to facilitate discussions either in the workplace or in the home on distracted driving. Joel mentioned the storybook that his group recently put out. An insurer, State Auto, had developed a storybook just like that and provided it to schools to help them speak up on distracted driving issues. Another way that insurers are providing tools is usage-based insurance programs, which are sort of an outgrowth of some of those monitored driving that you have with commercial vehicles. Usage-based or telematics-based insurance programs, number one, they measure how you drive, things like hard braking and hard acceleration, and those are predictive of how often people have claims and get into accidents. But it also provides feedback, real-time feedback for drivers about how they're performing, how fast they're going, how often they're slamming on the brakes or making rapid accelerations. And they also track their engagement with the phone, so people can get real-time feedback. This is how many times you touched your phone. I think one of the other speakers referenced a study from Cambridge Mobile Telematics, which is a provider of the software that many insurers use for these kinds of usage-based or telematics-based programs, and some of the information in there about how often people engage with their phones while they're driving is truly, it really gives you some pause about how often, and probably reflects better about how often people are interacting with their devices while they drive than even some, what they'll admit to on a survey or things like that. So those are some examples of the ways the insurance industry is engaging on these kinds of things.
In terms of enforcement, we've heard Robin, I believe it was talking about the difficulty of getting information after a crash and the ability to subpoena things and so forth. And because it's hard to do, unlike with DUI, where you just have a breathalyzer, which you can do right there on the spot. How far are we, is it even possible? And Ian, I would encourage you to kind of jump in here as well. Are we getting close to the point where it'll be relatively simple to pull information off a phone, where a police officer could say, hey, I have a question. I realize we get into some Fourth Amendment kinds of circumstances, but there's also an opportunity to say, well, we'll figure out a way to streamline this. You were just involved in a crash, and so now we have probable cause at that point. I'm wrapping a whole lot of stuff into it from a strategic level here, but and anybody, you can chime in at any point here. So Robert, you got the short straw. You get to go first. Everybody else can chime in as they feel like it.
I think it's still, unless you have authorization from, like, if it's the insurer's policyholder and it would help defend, to help them defend the policyholder, then they have a reason to share that data with their insurer. If it's an adverse party, I think you're right. It's difficult. You can get it by subpoena. It's difficult. There's obstacles to getting that information. Another related issue, though, is the vehicle that the data, or the data that the vehicle tracks. Since these phones are often connected via Bluetooth, there's often some data trail there about what was connected to the vehicle at the time of the crash, and maybe if there was data being transmitted in some way. And that's a coming issue. Most vehicles have what's called an event data recorder, these days. But it was the rules around that were created at a time when there was very limited information. It was mechanical information about whether the brakes were engaged and if it was steering, and very limited information. But with today's vehicles capturing more and more information, in some cases capturing whether or not some sort of driver assistance feature was engaged or not, being able to access that kind of information is going to be very important, not only for investigating any accident for law enforcement, but for an insurance company to be able to determine what happened after an accident. So that kind of information will become important, not only to judge whether distraction was involved, but if there was some sort of automated feature that was engaged at the time of the accident that might have led the person to engage in distracted driving behavior.
And
Great.
if you
Robin,
don't mind,
you're up next.
Okay, if you don't mind, I'll jump in on this, Bob. I think you make an important point that the types of data and sources of data that are available, they're there and we're getting more of them, and the challenge will really be around accessing them and for what purpose they're accessed and who can access them. And I know in Canada we dealt with many of the same issues when it comes to privacy, for example, to try and access the phone use. But I do want to come back to a couple of different things that I heard you say, Bob, as well as Ian, in terms of what can we do to make a difference, to change, and what do we see as some of the solutions. And Ian, you made a great point about technology, providing one of those opportunities to create those environmental cues, to prompt people to make safer choices. And I think in the absence of technology, one of the most powerful things all of us can do today, starting today, is to speak up about our choices. And we know that our behavior influences the behavior of people around us. And I think we all need to capitalize on that and speak up about why it's important to make safe choices and why we make safe choices. And I know our organization has done a little bit of work around that. We have a vodcast episode around distracted driving, and we talk with not just young drivers, but adult drivers and enforcement as to the importance of the issue and what are some of those nuggets of information you can use to speak up. And we've also done a TikTok episode with Toronto Police Service talking about distraction and how do you speak up and why do you speak up. And I think the other point that came up was about the technology in the vehicles and the infotainment systems. And Ian, you talked a little bit about some of the guidelines that have been put forward. And I think it's important that we equally spend time educating drivers, because ultimately drivers demand certain expectations, right, for their vehicles. There are things that they want to be able to do while they drive. So for vehicle manufacturers, it's a bit of a rock and a hard place. They can not put them in, but then consumers demand they put them in and are going to buy vehicles with it in. So I think in addition to using regulation to help increase safety, we also need to educate consumers about those safety choices to ensure that when technologies are rolled out, that there's a high level of public acceptance for them. And then the last point, Bob, you made was really about the heavy truck industry and commercial fleets. And I think that really shines a spotlight on the importance of employers in terms of taking ownership of distraction in the workplace, and people who drive, not just professional drivers who drive every day, but people who drive for sales, for healthcare, and have a lot of commuting, or even employees that just commute back and forth to work. As employers, the cost of distracted driving collisions is significant when one of your employees is injured. So I think if we can capitalize on some of the learning with heavy truck industry and fleet vehicles in terms of how quickly they've rolled out distracted driving prevention policies as part of workplace safety, and encourage other employers to do same, I think those are some great opportunities to make progress.
Thank you, Robin. At NTSB, we have a very strict distracted driving problem. And of course, right now I'm on Go Team, which means if there's a major incident or crash, I could get launched to pretty much anywhere. But my phone is set up so that when I am in the car, it will send a message to our Response Operations Center, the ROC as it's known, to say, hey, not now, but he'll be getting someplace soon. And as soon as I get to wherever it is, and usually it's not more than 45 minutes or so, then my phone will remind me, hey, you've got an important call you need to deal with this. Ian, did you have any observations on our last discussion here?
Well, with regard to technology, Robin did mention roadside smart cameras as a potential opportunity to make an impact with distracted driving. And I'm curious to ask if anybody on the panel knows about experiences over in Europe about their use. I know the Netherlands has put them into play, and I believe Australia has as well. And this is something that we are at the Insurance Institute. We're looking at starting to evaluate a setup that might be used here in the States. And I think that's an opportunity. And I don't know what the experience is outside of the US.
Right. So I'll jump in on that. So definitely more acceptance around automated enforcement technologies in Europe and certainly in Australia. And I think that has a little bit to do with some of the philosophy around how they're viewed. So more often in European countries and in Australia, you'll see them viewed as standard safety features, similar to things that we routinely put on vehicles. So if you think about your seatbelt, right? No one would argue with having a seatbelt in the car. So for example, in Europe, the ignition interlocks for alcohol, those are much more widely accepted and adopted because they're viewed as a safety device that's prevented as similar to a seatbelt. And I think with respect to automated enforcement, creating that public acceptance around how it's used and being clear about why it's used and the purpose for which it's used, and some of the checks and balances that make the use of that technology transparent. I think in Europe and Australia, they've probably done a better job with that because at the end of the day, it's really about safety and preventing crashes. And you think about law enforcement out there on the roads enforcing traffic laws, and road crashes are a leading cause of death for law enforcement, and we simply don't have enough officers and resources to go out there and achieve the level of deterrence through enforcement that's needed. And automated technologies can really allow us to be much more efficient and cost effective in terms of how we do that while achieving safety.
I think one of the problems that we've had with automated enforcement, like red light cameras and speed cameras, is that in some jurisdictions it was used as a revenue source as opposed to a safety source. And I believe we've got some people in the coalition who have come up with some model legislation of how that could be managed so that drivers understood that if you get a ticket, it is legitimate. There will be a proper appeals process. And by the way, this isn't just about going into the general fund. This is about making sure that the roads are safe. Before I forget, we have two questions that came in. One involves some confusion regarding where you have an intersection that also happens to coincide with a railroad crossing. And so there are the red flashing crossing lights as well as the traffic lights. And the questioner asks, it said, distracted drivers would have clearer information if only standard traffic lights were used. Could we standardize regular traffic lights at railroad crossings and eliminate the red flashing lights? Ian, I'm going to toss that one to you because this is a human factors question. And now personally, I've never had a problem with this, but we seem to have people who don't understand what a gate is for, and they go around and unfortunately we have quite a number of grade crossing crashes. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've got to think. I have little experience with rail, but my thoughts as a human factors psychologist would be that the signage needs to be distinctly different at a crossing with railroads, and also involving a intersection of a street close by, that you need to differentiate that and have a very distinct signal from traffic lights.
It would seem like it would be easy enough to coordinate them. So if the railroad crossing lights come on, that the traffic light also turns red.
Yes.
And as the gate comes down, what part of red and gate down do you not understand? It's a rhetorical question, but we'll go on. The second question was, and I don't know if anybody here has any traffic engineer experience, but this says, one of the problems of our current transportation system is that there are so many delays due to traffic signals. Well, I don't know that anybody would argue that point. As a bicyclist, I often observe that when drivers are stopped at a signal, they look at their phone. And then goes on to say, roundabouts, on the other hand, encourage an active participation in the driving experience. And maybe we should reduce the number of traffic signals and go more for roundabouts. So any thoughts on that one?
So I'll start off, and then anyone else is welcome to chime in. I know in a number of jurisdictions, certainly across Canada, and I suspect in the US as well, there is a more widespread adoption of roundabouts, simply because they definitely are safer. They have lower speeds, and yes, to the person who asked the question, they definitely encourage active participation. I think we underestimate perhaps the complexity of intersections and how dangerous they are, and for that reason there is a stronger move towards roundabouts. At the same time, there's a lot of work and resources and engineering that needs to go in to make them safe, and I know in Canada, at least from our experience, we also need to do a better job educating about roundabouts and kind of who has the right of way, and you know what the road rules are with respect to roundabouts. But we are seeing some progress in implementing those in areas in lieu of an intersection for safety reasons, and that's part of the Safe Systems Vision Zero approach.
Okay. I think what we'll do is go kind of do one more round with everybody, and the question, which is going to be a challenge for all of us, is, Bob, I'll start with you. What is it that keeps you awake at night in terms of this distracted driving problem? And if you could do one thing, what would that be?
I guess, you know, one of the things that really concerns me is, you know, the increasing technology in the vehicle, and its ability, and its increasing ability to help keep us out of trouble could be the very thing that gets us into more trouble. I'm, you know, in addition to my duties at APCI, I'm also a board member at the Highway Law Stat Institute, which is part of IIHS. So I'm privy to a lot of their research on the kind of things that Ian talks about. And I have a real concern that people will become even more over-reliant. I think people look at the vehicle as sort of an extension of their living room. It's become a very comfortable place, and all the comforts of home are there. And as the vehicle gets more sophisticated and it's able to keep you out of trouble more, you become over-reliant on that. And I think there's just no substitute for a engaged driver who's paying attention and alert at all times for all aspects of safety. So that's what really keeps me, you know, that we're going to find other things that are going to keep our attention off the task at hand. That's what really concerns me.
So maybe one of the best things that will happen is that the vehicle senses when you're not paying enough attention and says, okay, if you don't fix this in about half a second, I'm going to start slowing down and look for a place to stop, and we'll talk about it.
Yeah.
Adrian, what about you?
Yeah, I like all this talk about the technology working to help us, you know, the do not disturb and those sorts of things. I would love if cars just didn't start unless there was a, do not disturb feature or something on our phones. I'm constantly, I just want to back up 2 seconds too. I'm always constantly in awe and surprised at what my kids notice outside of the car and inside the car. They can tell me the light is red, the light is green. Like they're starting that, they're 2, 3, and 4, and they're understanding traffic signals already and pointing them out. And so really the education part to me speaks volumes. And I guess I hope that people they value their families and other people's families enough that you want people to be contributing members of society and good adults and, polite, and, it needs to be taught to kids and reinforced by parents so effectively that it's what you do,
I think as Joel mentioned, we have an opportunity with the next generation. I think we've lost one here that we're going to have to kind of think about this a little differently. But for the next generation, your children's generation, I think there's a great opportunity there. Thank you. Ian, any further closing thoughts from you?
Sure. So I guess something that keeps me up at night was, seeing the data points that I shared in my opening statement, that, we now have 10% of the US, this was a representative sample of US drivers, 10% admitting to having video calls, watching movies, posting on social media. That just is, that goes, text messaging, when that came out, that was bad enough. But that just is a very scary level of engrossment in the cell phone. And, if I could wave my wand and do anything, I would start a Cash for Clunkers program, and people have to buy a car with crash avoidance. Not necessarily plugging the automation that Bob talks about, where I do think you have self-driving cars, I am very worried about the level of distractions. We've seen data that distraction is going to get worse with people using automation, but crash avoidance is different. It's on in the background and acts when it detects an imminent crash is likely to happen or is going to happen. So that's what I would like to see.
Okay, great. Robin?
Sure. So the one thing that keeps me up at night is the underestimation we see of the unexpected that happens on the road, which goes back to something you talked about, Vice Chairman, at the beginning, is we may drive the same road every day. We may take the same route. We are very comfortable, to Ian's point, driving. It feels almost automatic. And we underestimate the complexity of driving, which is in itself a divided attention task. And we underestimate the potential for that unexpected to happen. And when it happens, as Adrian and Joel and many other families know, you can't take it back, right? It happens and you can't take it back. So Ian, I'm going to take your magic wand, and if I could wave it for a moment, I would want every person who uses the road, before they get behind the wheel, before they get on their bicycle, before they step off the curb, this is something I've said before, to think about how their choices on the road that day matter. It's not about how good a driver I was yesterday. It's about how good a driver I am today, right now, on this trip. And if we could get everyone to think that thought before they use the road every single day, we could make a tremendous difference in the outcomes that we experience.
I'm going to let everybody in on a little secret. I've already told you one, but this is the second one. I'm privileged to be able to fly, have been flying airplanes pretty much all of my adult life. I can tell you from personal experience, having driven a long road trip and having flown the same thing in an aircraft, it's much easier in the air. There's a lot less to hit, and it doesn't require the same level of attention. There are times and places where it requires a bit more skill than driving a car, but most of the time it does not. And in aviation, to Ian's point about automation, we've been at automation now for over 70 or 80 years, and we still don't have it right. And it's a whole lot easier in the sky than it is on the highways. Driving is a complicated task. So we need to figure out how to elevate that and get people to understand and appreciate. I think this is a good place for us to wrap up this discussion, but not to wrap up the discussion going forward at the dinner table and with friends and business colleagues and for the coalition at large, to think about how important this is, how many lives we can save. By the end of today, we will have lost another 9 or 10 people that we know about for sure, and had another several thousand who've had significant injuries because of distracted driving. So it's a righteous cause. We can do some good things here. So I thank all of you who have joined us to watch. I thank the members of our panel today, and let's go out there and be safe. Thank you so much.